Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and this is my review of episode 4 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds called Memento Mori. And I think at this point it is safe to say that this show is indeed much better than Star Trek Discovery and definitely better than Picard. But it's far from perfect, I still have a list of complaints, and many of the problems with it is because it's a prequel, because it's supposed to be set a few years before TOS and set on the same ship with some of the same characters, which creates a bunch of inconsistencies and illogical things, and if not for that, if not for this show being a prequel, a lot of these problems wouldn't be problems. So maybe they should just admit it's not a direct prequel, maybe they should say it's a reboot, a remake, or it's all in a different timeline. Something like that would explain away all these small inconsistencies, because most of them are not a problem within the show itself, but they are a problem if we try to connect it all to the bigger Star Trek franchise. So maybe that's what they should do. Simply say it's a different timeline and then it doesn't have to connect perfectly with the other shows, and that way they can recycle the same ideas which were in TOS and basically make a remake of them and do them in a different way or in a better way hopefully, and then I will be fine with it. But if they still try to pretend as if it's a direct prequel and then make all these mistakes, then it kind of annoys me. And the biggest continuity issue in this episode is the fact that they know all about the Gorn, and yet years later, when Kirk first met the Gorn in the TOS episode Arena, he reacted as if it's the first time ever he hears about them. He never said, "Oh, so those are the Gorn I heard so much about, the same Gorn who attacked my own starship with some of my members of the crew who I serve with who never told me about the Gorn." Like, it's the first time ever that I hear the name Gorn. And also in TOS they kept referring to the Gorn ship as an unknown alien ship. They didn't recognize it. We could explain that away by saying maybe the Gorn were using a totally different style of ship in that specific event, and that's why the Enterprise didn't recognize them as being Gorn. That I could buy, but then the fact that when Kirk heard the name Gorn he had zero reaction to it, and also later on in his log he referred to it as that's what the Metrons call those aliens, so it was as if it was the first time ever he hears that name, and that makes no sense if it all takes place just a few years after his own ship and some of his own members of his own crew were fighting the same aliens just a little while ago and he has no knowledge of it. So that makes no sense. Even if we say it all got classified for some reason, it still would be really silly and contrived, and that's the same kind of excuse they try to do with Discovery, trying to fix all the continuity mistakes by saying everything just got classified for absolutely no reason other than that, just because they wanted to clean up the continuity. That's why they did it. And so again, it would have been better to simply admit it's all in a new timeline, a remake, and then not having to do that, not having to insert these silly excuses just to try to correct continuity. The same thing with the holograms, the fact they said in Discovery that the Enterprise's holograms just broke down forever, and that's why they will be using the view screen instead forever, and so that's kind of silly. So if the technology exists, how come they cannot fix it? And some fans have made up excuses like all the technology that Discovery had, which was not supposed to exist yet in the 23rd century, such as the holodecks and the Synthahol and replicators and stuff like that. Many people said, oh, it's because Discovery was a prototype, it was a super advanced ship testing out all the latest technology which the Enterprise didn't have for decades later and all of that. And yet in this show we have the same problem now, because now it's actually set on the same Enterprise, and yet it's still far more advanced than TOS, and so that same excuse doesn't really work anymore. So it doesn't work as a direct prequel. And another small example, when they show the ship's cargo bay, it's open to space and only protected by a force field. The same as with Discovery, when its cargo bay was always open and only a force field is holding everything. And yet in TOS they didn't have a force field in their shuttle bay. They had to open and close the shuttle doors every time, and they had to depressurize and pressurize the entire shuttle bay every single time a shuttle would go out or in. So maybe in the very end of this show they will say, oh, the ship's force fields broke down and that's why we have to close the door every time now and pressurize and repressurize the shuttle bay, because our technology just broke down and we cannot fix it for some reason. I guess that will be the excuse to explain that away. So things like that, the lack of attention to detail, still annoys me in the show. And the same with some of the characters, the fact that Uhura knew Pike for years before she knew Kirk, and yet when Pike got disfigured and he was on the Enterprise, she never came to visit him to pay her respect. The same with the nurse Chapel, And what about Noonien Singh, who is a relative of Khan, and yet when Khan was on the ship, no one ever mentioned that. I guess they will explain somehow later, because what's even the point of making her related to Khan unless Khan is going to get involved in it later somehow. So I guess they will meet Khan at some point and then classify it. That's why Kirk never knew about it. When he met Khan again, he never knew that Khan was on his own ship just a few years ago in different circumstances, and maybe Khan's memory got wiped out also. And only Spock knows everything, but he's hiding it. Spock is the biggest liar ever in the history of the galaxy, because everyone in his life get classified and he has to keep all these secrets and not reveal it to Kirk later. So things like that will make it ridiculous to watch TOS later on, with all this convoluted BS supposedly taking place before that. So everything got classified, and Spock knows everything but hides it from Kirk all the time. So that will be extremely stupid. And they even mentioned Spock's sister Michael Burnham in this episode, because when he mind melds with Noonien Singh, then she's surprised to learn that he has a secret sister, which is not in the records, that's what she said, and that makes no sense with continuity with Discovery, because in Discovery Season 1, they kept saying how famous Michael is, that the entire fleet is talking about her, everyone knows about her, including the prisoners that she met in the 3rd episode. When she came to the Discovery, everyone in the entire fleet knew about her, knew that she's the one who started the war with the Klingons, which was a major event that everyone knew about. When Lorca took her out of prison, Admiral Kathleen Kennedy said that it will damage the fleet morale, knowing that she's not in prison when she's the one who caused the war and all of that. So it was obvious that everyone knows about her. Mad knew about her, the Klingons knew about her, so it would be impossible to classify the existence of someone like that. And also later on, when Discovery was in the future, they said that the Vulcans do know all about her, that her existence is actually well documented as Spock's sister. So how come they now say in this show that her whole existence was completely classified? Like, I could buy the fact that they faked Discovery's destruction, that they said that it blew up in that fight with Control and never went to the future, that will be okay. But no, now they're saying that her existence is completely erased and no one knows about her. And so that's why it makes no sense. That's why I say it's a lack of attention to detail, even inside of their own shows. So things like the cargo bay not having a door but only having a force field, that's annoying. And also in one part of the episode they dock with another ship, using that sleeve corridor thing, which they also used one time in Discovery, when Discovery and Enterprise docked together. And then the door opened into both ships, and into the middle of the ship into a long corridor without any airlock in between. And that really annoyed me in Discovery, and they do it again here in this show when they dock with that little ship. And the door opens into the main corridor of the Enterprise with no airlock in the way whatsoever. And so that's really annoying, because that's not how it was even in the time of TNG. They still used airlocks when docking with other starbases and ships. You didn't directly open the corridor into the whole ship from an open door leading into space. And so that kind of thing annoys me. I would be fine with such a thing being shown in a more distant future, like in season 3 and 4 of Star Trek Discovery, when they are centuries into the far future. Then I wouldn't complain, because I would say that force field simply became so reliable and so powerful and so quick that they will be able to handle any situation, and so they don't have to use airlocks anymore and so on. So I could be fine with that in the distant future, but I'm not fine with it in a prequel of TOS, when in TOS they had to pressurize and repressurize the shuttle bay and had airlocks everywhere, even in TNG time, and yet a century before TNG they don't bother to put any airlocks. You can just walk into the ship from space into the middle of the corridor, into a long corridor. Now, the rest of the technobabble stuff in this episode was actually pretty decent. I think they finally got a science advisor, and so all their technobabble sounds much more plausible now. It's not perfect, but it doesn't sound as stupid as some of the dialogue in Discovery often was. Whenever they were trying to do sciencey talk, it always was a complete disaster. It always made absolutely no sense scientifically wise, so obviously they had no science advisor on Discovery, and they've got one in this show, so all the technobabble sounds much better now. And a lot of things in this show are much better. Visually, I think it looks great. A lot of the actors are great. Even the characters are fine. A few of them are annoying a little bit here and there. And the writing also feels much better, even though it's not really that original, because many of the ideas in this episode were done many times before in Star Trek shows and movies. But at least it was done well in this episode. It didn't feel like it's worse than how it was done before. In some ways it was better, visually definitely better. And what I'm referring to is the whole way of how they fight their enemy in this episode. It's not the usual battle in space in which you just fire a bunch of torpedoes and phaser beams and just do maneuvers and all of that, but instead they have to go hide inside a brown dwarf in this case, and then it becomes like a submarine battle of wits in which you have to outsmart your enemy and every hit counts, and it's all tenseful and all of that. So it's the same kind of style as the TOS episode Balance of Terror, or the final battle in Star Trek 2 when they were hiding in a nebula, or in the Deep Space Nine episode Starship Down when they had to take the Defiant into a gas giant to hide from some Jem'Hadar ships, and then they were using a kind of sonar to detect their enemy, and so it was like a submarine battle, and so that's what they're doing in this episode, and that was done pretty well. I was pleasantly surprised at how well this episode did it, and not just with the battle itself, but also the way the characters reacted, how everything felt tenseful, and the ship was overheating, so everyone was sweating, and so that also added something to it. The only small nitpick I have with that is that Spock was sweating like everyone else. He should have been sweating a little bit less at least, because Vulcans are much more heat resistant because they evolved on a much hotter planet. So why is he sweating just like everyone else? Because of the heat. It would have been a nice touch, a nice attention to detail if he was at least sweating a little bit less than everyone else. And I think most of the characters are fine. Noonien Singh was a little bit annoying because her tragic backstory, her childhood trauma, which is mentioned in every single episode, is mentioned again and expanded upon again, and now she's seeing the ghost of her dead brother all the time, and stuff like that is becoming a little bit annoying because it's kind of too much too quickly, and in every single episode. And also her behavior is kind of obnoxious a lot of times, constantly being angry and aggressive. I guess it's kind of similar to how Worf was in TNG. But in TNG it was more used for comedy. It was comedic the way that he's always angry and aggressive and all of that. In so many times Worf suggested a course of action which everyone else rejected, and yet if they had listened to him, then the episode would have ended earlier because they would have solved the problem early on, and yet no one ever listened to Worf, and that's why they were always getting into trouble because they didn't listen to him. And yet in this show, she's the one who gives the most aggressive advice, and they do listen to her, and that ends up saving the ship every single time. She's the first one to say, raise the shields, and they do, and then it's in the last moment before they get hit by something. So she's constantly saving the ship with her aggressiveness. So I have some mixed feelings on this character, because in some ways I do like her, and it's an example of how to show a strong female character the right way, because they actually show her being competent and clever. And yet they kind of go overboard with her attitude, like she's been obnoxious too many times, and so that becomes annoying. And the same with Ortegas, who I also kind of like in some ways, but way too often she has an annoying attitude and makes those snarky remarks and comebacks and stuff like that, which I guess they're trying to appeal to the teenagers of today who talk like that, and so I guess that's why they're doing it, or it's supposed to be funny. It kind of reminds me of Raffi in Star Trek Picard. And I guess it was supposed to be funny, but it was more annoying than funny most of the time. So the same thing here with Ortegas, who constantly has to say something snarky. Why can't she just say, yes sir, I will do my job? No, she has to say something else on top of that, and Pike just accepts it. So most of the episode was about them fighting the Gorn while hiding inside that brown dwarf, which caused it to become more like a submarine battle of barely detecting the other ship and all of that, and it's a battle of wits, and all of that stuff was good, but then it had all these little illogical inconsistencies. For example, they say the pressure is so high and it actually does crash some of the smaller Gorn ships, and yet at some point they take a shuttle out of the ship and the shuttle is just fine, even though smaller Gorn ships were being crashed by the pressure, and yet a shuttle is totally fine with no mention of a danger. And so little inconsistencies like that. And the Gorn themselves were never shown physically, which I guess is a good thing, because no one was supposed to know how they look like until Kirk meets them. I know we saw a skeleton of a Gorn in Lorca's office in Discovery, but since it was a skeleton, we can assume that maybe they did find skeletons of them, but never actually saw a living Gorn, and so that was not really a big continuity issue in Discovery, and yet now they're actually fighting the Gorn and their ships, and they consider them a big threat to the Federation and all of that, and yet Kirk never heard about them later. And also when they rescued those refugees from the planet, one of them tells them about the Gorn, and she makes clicking sounds with her tongue, and yet that's not how we heard the Gorn sound like when Kirk fought a Gorn in Arena. The Gorn wasn't making clicking sounds, he was making those growling sounds like sounds like that. He wasn't making clicking sounds, and so that actually sounded more like those aliens who abducted Riker in the TNG episode Schisms. That's what it sounded like. So maybe they should have simply had totally different aliens in this episode. Why even make it the Gorn at all? Why create these unnecessary continuity issues when they don't have to? It could have been some random new alien which we never saw before. That would be far more interesting than trying to recycle something from TOS. And my biggest problem with what they did with the Gorn in this show is that they keep insisting and showing that, oh, the Gorn are absolutely evil, they have no remorse at all, they just want to kill everyone, they want to eat us, they want to use our bodies as breeding sacks and stuff like that. And so they're painting them as absolutely evil aliens that it would be impossible to ever negotiate with. But it again makes no sense with why did Kirk spare that Gorn when he met him on the planet. After he defeated him, he refused to kill him because he said, and I quote, maybe you thought you were protecting your own territory, maybe that's why you attacked. And obviously he thought that it is possible to make peace with the Gorn in the future, maybe they can become allies in the future, maybe it was all a misunderstanding, maybe a diplomatic solution. And yet the way they show them in this show is that they're absolute monsters with no remorse. And all the Gorn are pure evil and all of that. And that goes completely against the whole message, the whole point of that TOS episode, which had that beautiful message in the end that your enemy is not pure evil, that it's not totally black and white, that maybe it is possible to make peace with your enemies. And that's the beautiful message of the old Star Trek shows, that very often, not always, but very often, they show that the villains, the enemies, can change, or you can make peace with them, you can find a diplomatic solution, or you can better communicate with them to find a common ground and all of that. Your enemies of the past can become your friends in the future. All those beautiful messages, the hopeful vision and all of that, which sadly was very lacking in the recent Star Trek shows, which is all about war and violence and just defeating and killing your enemy. So that's another big difference between TOS and this show, even though I guess later on in this show maybe they will explore this idea as well. Maybe they just don't do it right away. Maybe a few episodes from now they will find that some Gorn are not as bad, maybe some Gorn are not so evil as the ones they met before, and so maybe they will play with that idea later on, and I hope they do, because otherwise I would say TOS is still far superior in terms of writing, because at least in TOS there were those morality tales, those good messages, those educational ideas in them and all of that, while in this show it's all about just an evil bad guy that you just have to defeat and that's it. But I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're simply not rushing it, that maybe that idea will be done a little bit later. But once again, it will still be a continuity mistake, because even if they make peace with the Gorn in some future episode, then it still wouldn't fit what we saw in TOS, because why did the Gorn attack that colony in TOS if they made peace with the humans? I guess maybe they can say there are different factions of different Gorn, maybe some of them are worse than others, maybe that's how they will explain it. But still, no matter how they do it, it will be problematic, unfortunately. They should have just invented a totally different new alien species, and then they could do whatever they want without it being a continuity mistake, at least. And another big problem with this show being a prequel is the fact that we know that certain characters survive since they make it to TOS, and so we'll never feel any danger for those characters. And so if they put someone like Uhura, for example, in a situation in which she supposedly might get killed soon, and yet we know she cannot possibly die in the show, and then that removes all the tension for that character. And an even bigger problem is one of the characters actually knows it himself, and namely Pike himself knows he will survive no matter what, because he knows that it will be only 10 years from now when he will suffer that horrible accident. No matter what he does, he cannot escape that fate. That was mentioned when he got that vision in Star Trek Discovery. So if he knows that, then why should he feel danger to his own life in any situation? Like, he will always know that he survives no matter what, and by extension he knows his ship will survive no matter what. And so when he takes the ship into a dangerous dive into the black hole and whatever, obviously he knows everything will be fine. And so that kind of makes him less courageous, because he knows he cannot die in any situation, and by extension that the ship will not be destroyed. And so that gives him this overconfidence that he knows everything will be okay no matter what. And that's a problem, because I think it would have been much more interesting if he didn't know at least the full details of exactly how or when his accident will take place, or if it will be a vague memory that will not be sure exactly when it will happen. Then he will be very brave, because then he will be on the edge of his seat constantly, always thinking maybe tomorrow will be the day when he becomes disfigured, and yet he chooses to endanger himself anyway. That will be true heroism if he faces his fear every single day. But instead they reveal to him that it will only be 10 years from now, and he knows whose crew members he will save, and they're not on the ship yet. So every single day he knows that nothing will happen to him, no matter what. And so that makes him less brave, because it makes him overconfident. He knows the ship will survive no matter what. And so that's another problem, I think. So those were some of the things that bugged me. Let me know what you think and we can discuss all of this in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.